Hey troops, welcome back to the channel. My name's Ryan, I'm a former Royal Marine from the United Kingdom. Today we're going to be reacting to Can Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia succeed? Original video link in description, guys. Going to get into this today. It's by Infographics. So I know a lot of people have mixed reviews on Infographics show, but I like it. Yes, it doesn't get everything right, but as YouTubers, you know, that's not our job to get everything right. We're just here to kind of, you know, give opinions on things, or at least that's all I'm here for anyway, guys. But yeah, I have got, you know, quite a bit of military experience to be able to give what I would like to deem semi-accurate advice on what's going on in Ukraine. So hopefully I can do this video proud. But before we get into it, guys, I need to mention that we've actually got a sponsor for the channel, and it's not like any other sponsor, guys. It's something that I've actually built myself. It's called Fitness Matrix Online Coaching. Link is in the description if you want to go check that out. I am basically training and mentoring individuals to reach their full potential physically and mentally, guys. So that's an online coaching platform that I'm using now to basically utilize wherever I am in the world, train anyone wherever they are in the world, whether your goal is to join the military, is to be a better athlete, whether it's to be a bodybuilder or to lose weight, okay, guys, or it can be pretty much tailored to whatever you want. I'm actively engaged in that platform, so go check it out. If anyone messages me on Instagram with the message train, I will literally add 50% to your online program, guys. So make sure to go check that out. Link is in the description. Let's do this.
Leopard 2 tanks and UAVs probe Russian defenses. Trenches crisscross the landscape for hundreds of miles. Artillery and missiles fly across the front lines in both directions. These are the events unfolding in Ukraine as Ukraine's offensive to take back their home begins. But can they succeed? Russia has vast reserves of resources and...
Right, so before we get into this, in terms of what I know about Ukraine, I'm not up to scratch as much as I was, say, 3-4 months ago. But can Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia succeed? Obviously it can. This is going to come to an end at some point. Do I see it going in Ukraine's favor? Yes, there's too much going into the country from other countries for it not to, in simple terms.
Men, they spend months preparing for the upcoming offensive, and the West has dragged its feet in delivering many of the weapons and supplies Ukraine desperately needs. The success of the offensive is contingent on 5 things. Let's find out what they are. In recent weeks, Vladimir Putin has gone on national television and announced we can definitely state that this Ukrainian offensive has begun. And for once, he would be right. Ukraine has indeed started its offensive, but in many ways, the operation has been going on for weeks. Ukraine has been conducting shaping operations by firing long-range missiles and artillery at Russian targets far behind the front lines.
Right, so HIMARS rocket systems introduced actually quite early on in the war, albeit they didn't have that many of them to have a sustainable capability, but they were doing a lot of damage on ammo dumps and stuff like that, hindering the progress and the movements of Russian troops, especially in the original counteroffensive, okay? We were covering that quite heavily. So if they've got enough of these things, HIMARS rocket systems can be very, very dangerous. They can be utilized in a shoot and scoot type tactic situation where, you know, you get these vehicles in, cause damage, get them out of there. They're very maneuverable. So if Ukraine uses their assets wisely, which I'm sure they will continue to do so, I'm sure they'll be very effective. We've seen how effective they were early on in the war.
This is done to weaken the Russian command structure and logistical capabilities.
Boom.
More recently, Ukraine has been sending small groups of tanks and armored vehicles into Russian-occupied territory. These units are not trying to break through Russian defenses or secure the region, but are instead probing their enemy's defenses in order to find weak spots that can be exploited down the road. This is known as the fighting reconnaissance stage of the offensive, and it's happening all across the front lines. It's only a matter of time before Ukrainian forces find an entry point and push through. But there is more that needs to happen besides just crossing the front lines if this offensive is to succeed. The only way that Ukraine will view the operation as a victory is if they can reclaim all of its stolen lands from Russia, including Crimea. Since Putin's reign over Russia would likely come to an end if this were to happen, entry points into the Crimean Peninsula will likely be some of the most heavily fortified areas in the entire region. If Ukrainian forces are able to secure Crimea, the war would be all but over. But first things first, the Ukrainian offensive will take time. This is because Russia has spent months preparing for this day. They've dug trenches, created vast minefields, and deployed anti-armor obstacles. The first thing Ukraine needs to do is penetrate the defenses and move men and supplies into Russian-occupied areas that they seize.
Now, this might seem quite obvious to a lot of you individuals watching this, but, you know, the aim of Russia, in simplistic terms, was to occupy, take over territory so that it can claim it as its own. But in the process, in doing so, they've actually destroyed all of the habitable lands that they want to take over and occupy. It would take bloody years and an atrocious amount of money to be able to get these areas restored, even if they did fully take over. I mean, you just look at Bakhmut. Bakhmut is a city, a great, glorious, big city, is absolutely decimated. There's nothing left. It would take years and billions to repair that place, to even be resemblance, to remotely resemble of what it used to. It's crazy. So, in my personal humble opinion, I don't know fully what it is, but it seems to be a lot more going on than just land grab. There seems to be something else.
Then they must protect whatever land they secure from Russian counterattacks. This may not be difficult for reasons that we'll get into in a bit, but before a push toward Crimea can be made, Ukraine must take back the southern parts of their country. Even if Ukraine manages to take most of its territory back, the war still won't be over. President Zelensky and Ukrainian officials have made it very clear the only way they will stop fighting is if all of Ukraine's land is returned, including Crimea. Even if Ukraine's offensive is largely successful, the war itself will last much longer. However, until the offensive plays out, what comes next is unknown. In order for Ukraine's offensive to succeed, they need to leverage 5 things: modern Western weapons, technology, and vehicles, their superior training, the extensive nature of the front line, the high morale of their soldiers, and the Ukrainian people's resourcefulness. Ukraine has all 5 of these things going for them, but it's important that they're used in tandem to ensure success in the offensive.
I was literally just about to say, that is the all well and good saying all of these things on an individual scale, but, you know, without them all working in sync, then it's not going to work. But he pretty much said that.
Before we analyze how each one of these factors could benefit Ukraine in the coming months, let's look at what's standing in Ukraine's way, in particular the vast network of defenses that Russia's constructed during the winter and spring months. When the cold weather of the winter began to roll into Eastern Europe and the fighting slowed, the Russian military took advantage of the lull to start constructing a massive amount of defenses. Everyone, including Russia, knew that when the ground thawed and the weather became warmer, Ukraine would be launching an offensive. During this break in fighting, Ukraine sent soldiers to be trained by NATO personnel on how to best use the Leopard 2 tanks that would be delivered. These military vehicles will play a pivotal role in the offensive to come. Rather than training their new conscripts adequately or taking a good hard look at how their forces have fared thus far in the war, Moscow decided to fall back on its favorite tactic of throwing a lot of men and resources at a problem in hopes that something will happen. In this case, Russian soldiers, construction workers, and contractors were tasked with building a series of trenches and fortifications that would counteract all of the training and new vehicles that Ukraine would use to launch their offensive in the summer months.
I don't think it would counteract all of the training that they've received. Now, we didn't do a lot of training when I was in the Marines on, you know, very specific things such as getting through trench systems that have been barbed wired, booby-trapped, all of that. But on an individual skills and drills level, you will learn things that will help you collectively able to overcome this. This is basic soldiering, being able to, you know, oh, there's a trench system, right, we need to fight through it. Or there's barbed wire, right? Okay, we need to do this procedure to get across it. It actually looks quite funny if you look on the internet, how the Royal Marines, how the British Army get across barbed wire. It involves throwing someone over it, who's, I'm not joking either, throwing someone over it and effectively stepping over them. So, yeah, there is ways and means to get across these things. It doesn't hinder the training that they've got. Common sense applies here, guys. And obviously, if there's fortified areas, the Russians are going to need to get in and out of these fortified areas at some point. It's not a matter of, well, you know, we're just going to stay within this fortified area forever. Okay, you need to get supplies, munitions, weaponry within these areas. So there's going to be weak points. It's about exploiting those weak and vulnerable points effectively.
Some are now calling what the Russians have built the most formidable defensive fortifications in the world. But this is probably an exaggeration, as the effectiveness of its defenses has yet to be tested. Russian minefields, concrete tank obstacles known as Dragon's Teeth, artillery impact zones, and trenches stretch across Ukraine from east to west. The problem the Ukrainian offensive faces is that Russia has time to create a multi-layered defense structure that consists of static defenses, motorized rifle battalions, and artillery. Each battalion is responsible for an area approximately 3 to 5 kilometers wide and 2 to 2.5 kilometers deep. This works out to around 4 square miles. A good example of the defensive structures that have been implemented by Russia can be seen outside the town of Mykhailivka. Here, Russians have enacted a 4-layered approach. 1.24 miles or 2 kilometers from the town, deep trenches have been dug to hinder the movement of Ukrainian vehicles. 1,600 feet or 500 meters behind that, there's a barrier of Dragon's Teeth that, when properly deployed, can stop a Leopard 2 tank in its tracks. The concrete barriers are set up in 3 different rows and will slow Ukrainian forces down when they get past the initial trenches. Another 820 feet or 250 meters behind the Dragon's Teeth wall is a trench system that's designed to house infantry and provide them with suitable protection against the oncoming forces. It's likely that the men in these trenches will be armed with anti-tank missiles and rocket-propelled grenades to attack and disable Ukrainian armor. The Russian soldiers would also be
Yeah, so it's going to be tough. It's not going to be easy. Training within NATO standards, within NATO countries, yes, is going to help that. But again, it's going to be difficult nonetheless. But like I said, you're not just going to be aiming for all of these non-vulnerable points. You're going to be aiming for vulnerable points. Now, that in itself is going to create a bit of a funnel effect. You're obviously going to expect the troops to come to the easiest, most vulnerable area, i.e. entry and exit points. So the Russians will be expecting that. So effective reconnaissance is going to have to be used. You're going to have to use softening up of the targets effectively, i.e. artillery and mortar fire. You're going to have to use decent aerial reconnaissance, which they've got anywhere in terms of drones and UAV support. It's going to have to be very thought out, okay? But there's one thing for sure. If there's a will, there's a way, and Ukraine seems to be finding the way all the time. There's one thing I've noticed with Russia is they might have all these defenses up, but they do seem to be lacking professionally. It's the little skills and drills that they do, you know, when they want to stop for a smoking break or something, they take the helmets off and they're not really bothered about the surroundings. So this is where Ukraine will win the war. It's the little bits that they'll win.
Supplemented by snipers and machine gunners to fire upon any Ukrainian soldiers who are advancing with the tanks or engineers that are deployed to repair damaged equipment. The infantry trenches would be used to hold the incoming Ukrainian forces at bay, while artillery and aircraft could provide support and decimate the bogged-down offensive units from a distance. The final layer of defense is another set of counter-mobility barriers, such as ditches, more Dragon's Teeth, and another trench for the Russian infantry to fall back to. It's here where Russian tanks and vehicles could also be stationed to launch a counterattack. The trenches here might also be used as command positions, along with providing supporting fire for the men located closer to the oncoming attack.
Command positions, yes. Effective command from those positions? Probably not.
As a last resort, this final trench may be used to provide covering fire as Russian forces retreat when Ukrainian forces overrun their defenses. The artillery support would be much further away from these defensive lines to allow for plenty of time to reposition or pull back. However, when the Ukrainian forces are slowed by the numerous obstacles, trenches, and Russian soldiers, shells will continuously rain down on their position. This is a key part of the Russian defense. The structures built don't necessarily have to stop Ukrainian forces. They just need to slow them down so there's a better chance of Russian artillery and missiles connecting with their targets. Most analysts agree that even though the Russian defense structure seems to be sound, incompetent leaders and unskilled conscripts will likely not be able to use them effectively. Although it is worth noting that in the first phase of the Ukrainian offensive, a newly delivered Leopard 2 tank was destroyed by a Russian artillery ambush without getting a single shot off. This was not a full-blown attack by the Ukrainians and was likely only a reconnaissance mission to find weak spots in the Russian lines. But it does go to show that Ukraine still needs to be cautious, as the Russians still have a massive amount of firepower, and Ukrainian forces only have a limited number of Western tanks at their disposal. Now let's look at the 5 things that will help Ukraine succeed in its offensive. It's highly probable that Ukraine will break through the Russian defenses at some point, and even though they are still vastly outnumbered, Ukraine could secure a tremendous victory in the coming months, and these are the reasons why. Number 1. Ukraine has modern Western weapons, technology, and vehicles.
Yeah, and this is a massive one. The fact that they've got the I don't want to say unlimited amount, but whenever they need, they seem to be provided, with modern weaponry, technology, and vehicles, and it does help out a great deal. In fact, that they don't need that much manpower in consideration to the Russians, in comparison to the Russians rather, because of the kit and equipment that they've got is far superior in many, many ways, especially the vehicles and the artillery and stuff like that. The HIMARS rocket systems are really wreaking havoc over there. So, yeah, I would say that's the number one thing that is going to actually help them adapt and overcome and win this war, especially within the counteroffensive phase.
It's clear from the initial invasion that the Russian military was not ready to fight against modern weapons wielded by dedicated and skilled Ukrainian soldiers. In fact, new reports suggest that Russia has lost at least 2,001 tanks since the beginning of the war. Putin and his associates believed they would roll into Kyiv, be welcomed with open arms.
A lot of these tanks, actually, that weren't fully destroyed have actually ended up back in Ukraine's within their possessions, and Ukraine has, revamped, refurbed, and fitted new bits and bobs to these tanks to make them work again. So they're actually using their own tanks against them now in the effort of the war, which is crazy when you think about it.
And the war would end. Obviously, this is not what happened. Instead, Russia finds itself in the second year of a war that they are losing badly, staring down the barrel of a Ukrainian offensive. Offensives normally require an army to be highly mobile. This is why tanks and armored transports are so vital to an offensive initiative.
Yeah.
It's estimated that countries backing Ukraine have sent around 1,550 combat vehicles and 230 tanks, most of which were from the Soviet era. However, at least 21 Leopard 2s have been delivered, with around 80 or more still to come. The United States is also sending Ukraine 31 M1A2 Abrams. The problem is that all these tanks will arrive after the offensive has already begun. The tanks and armored vehicles Ukraine does have will allow them to outmaneuver and penetrate Russian defenses. Once Ukrainian forces identify a weak spot that will allow them to infiltrate Russian-held territory, things will quickly spiral out of control for Russia.
Do you really think it will spiral out of control for Russia, though, guys? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments.
The modern Western tanks are stronger, more durable, and faster than anything Russia currently has on the battlefield. The key for Ukraine is to make good decisions and not get trapped in an artillery kill zone, which is another reason why mobility will be so important in the coming offensive. Most armored vehicles that NATO has sent to Ukraine will be able to withstand a direct hit without killing everyone inside. This is vital to protecting the much smaller troop numbers that Ukraine has compared to Russia's massive conscript army. The Western armored transports will play a pivotal role in getting troops to where they need to go as safely and quickly as possible. The same cannot be said about Russian transports that have been picked off and decimated by Western anti-tank and anti-armor weapons that Ukraine wielded at the beginning of the conflict. It's weapons like the US-made Javelin that are the reason why so many Russian tanks and armored vehicles have been destroyed. Ukraine also has the benefit of Western unmanned aircraft systems that allow for exceptional reconnaissance for combined arms warfare tactics. Combined arms warfare is a strategy that modern militaries use to ensure every unit in an attack has support.
This is something that Russia doesn't do very well. So just to put it very basic for you guys that don't know, in the military, you're normally, hopefully, going to have access to very basic infantry units, mechanized infantry, you're going to have armored infantry, you're going to have various assets that support those roles, you're going to have fire support elements, anything from machine guns to mortar to artillery, and then you've got tanks, and then you've got air support, and then you've got planes, and then you've got intelligence and HQ elements. You've got all of these different bits, logistical support, all working together. Okay, so for a specific operation, instead of sending 100 infanteers to their deaths, you might send, 20, a troop of individuals. But on the right flank, you're going to have mortar fire. On the left flank, you're going to have artillery. In the in the sky, you're going to have drones, giving you aerial combat footage live. You're going to be able to have a HQ element to direct within use of that drone technology where to go on the battlefield. And in support of all that, you might have one or two tanks, and you might have vehicles that are armored to be able to get personnel to the front lines quicker. So you've got all of these little elements working in situ with each other. Russia instead will just send a couple of tanks and then, yeah, we don't need the rest. That's why they've been very unsuccessful at these little operations. The way Ukraine's doing things is the way NATO will train, all right? The way I've been trained to do things, working with, maybe it's a little bit less of everything, but working with everything as opposed to one or two elements, okay? It's really, really simple, but believe it or not, Russia hasn't used that tactic.
Soldiers are protected by armored carriers and tanks while providing reciprocal support for those units. Aircraft provide intel and cover from above. Combined arms tactics are used as a multi-pronged approach that utilizes multiple branches of the military. This allows for more effective combat operations, which is why analysts were shocked when Russia did not employ combined arms operations at the beginning of the war.
They never really have though, guys, okay? They'll just go through brute strength of like, well, let's just barrage this position with artillery. And they'll literally hammer that position with an unlimited amount or seemingly unlimited amount of artillery and then run out of munitions and not be able to hold it down. And they'll not have any enemy support within the area to be able to, you know, retain those positions after they've been blasted. The way they do things is almost comical now. It was outdated in World War II, never mind now.
This is another reason why their tanks and armor were so vulnerable. The unmanned aircraft systems Ukraine has received from the West and is utilizing in the offensive to identify targets such as artillery positions are incredibly important for the success of the mission. They're also being used for damage assessments and information gathering. And of course, the UAVs are perfect for spotting gaps in the Russian lines that can be exploited. All of these things are vital to the success of the Ukrainian offensive. Without the modern weapons, vehicles, and equipment being sent to Ukraine by the West, the offensive would have a much lower chance of success. But as long as Ukraine continues to operate with precision and modern tactics, their skill will only be complemented by Western equipment that they already have. Number 2. Ukrainian forces have been trained well. As Russia showed the world at the beginning of the war, numbers aren't everything. Even though the Russian military vastly outnumbered Ukrainian forces, they could not defeat them. This is partly because of the NATO training that Ukraine's military leaders and soldiers received. Conversely, Russia had sent undertrained and inexperienced soldiers into combat, and the results speak for themselves. While Russia was digging trenches and setting up defenses all winter, Ukrainians were receiving further training on how to use the Leopard 2 tanks and tactics that will aid in their offensive. The unfortunate part for Russia is that during their invasion, they lost a lot of their seasoned veterans and had to rely heavily on conscripts and hired mercenaries like the Wagner Group. This is because Russian forces suffered from poor military leadership, ineffective joint operations, and faulty Federal Security Service intelligence and planning. So, when push comes to shove, well-trained Ukrainian troops will be able to beat practically any force that Russia can throw at them. The training that Ukrainian troops and military leaders are receiving has set them up to launch a successful offensive. They'll hit Russian weak points hard and fast, where unskilled soldiers will not be able to mount a proper defense. Right now, Russia has around 70 combat regiments and brigades in Ukraine. However, only a fraction of the men in those units have had adequate combat training or have been in a battle before. This means mistakes will be made, which the well-trained Ukrainian soldiers will be more than happy to exploit.
Never underestimate the fact that you might think, oh, they'll adapt and overcome pretty quickly. Well, a lot of these mercenaries, a lot of these conscripts won't be able to adapt and overcome. You've got to understand, British forces, for instance, you know, you're not made to join the military. Everyone's a volunteer. And that means to a degree you want to be there. Even some of the guys who don't really want to be there, they still made the choice to sign on the dotted line, okay? And even then, when push comes to shove, you can't really tell what someone's going to be like until really, really pushed and tested. Now, Ukraine soldiers, even those who haven't been actively engaged in, you know, kinetic operations before, let's say they're getting trained by elite British military personnel within NATO. There's a fact, there's something you can't deny. They will be trained to a very hard standard. They'll be pushed harder than they ever have been before, and they're going to learn an awful lot for that. So when they come to actually experiencing this real time, they'll be better prepared than any of the Russians will ever be, because whether you like it or not, our training, and I'm speaking for myself, it is superior. It's far superior, guys, to what these guys are going through. So Ukraine, yeah, I'm not surprised that they are, you know, leading the way and doing really, really well in comparison to their counterparts. The only people that you really got to worry about to a degree is the private military contractors, the mercenaries, Wagner Group, okay? Because some of these guys, you don't know where they come from, okay? A lot of them are there to make money. We obviously know that. and you can't really put a tally on where they've actually came from. They might have actually came from a country where their military is actually quite well trained. You know, they might have had many operations behind their belts before. So yeah, these are the guys that you got to worry about, okay? In terms of the conscripts, nah, these are just bakers and electricians who, yeah, some of them might want to fight, but most of them haven't got it in the minerals, guys. Trust me.
The other problem Russia faces with its poorly trained soldiers is that they won't have enough competent troops to fill the gaps in their defensive lines. An even bigger problem will be that Russian forces won't be able to launch successful counterattacks to provide their units time to regroup and push back any Ukraine tanks and soldiers that make it past their defenses. It's also worth noting that untrained soldiers are not the only problem Russia faces during the Ukrainian offensive.
Guys, if you've made it this far, please like, share, and subscribe to the content. And if you haven't seen the beginning introduction, this video is sponsored by Matrix Fitness Online Coach. It's a platform that I own, and I'm an active coach on there. So if you want to better your lifestyle, you want to become fit, strong, whatever your goal is, whether it's to join the military or just to be fit and competent in day-to-day life, physically, health, all of that stuff we cover on there. Join today. Link is in the description. If you send me a direct message on Instagram and you type the message train, I'm going to give you 50% off that, guys. So please consider joining. Link is in the description. Time to change.
Although the Russian defenses look formidable, this might be deceiving. It's been uncovered that many of the defensive fortifications were dug and built by contractors who had little to no military engineering experience. This lack of expertise may have resulted in fortifications that are completely inadequate to repel the incoming Ukrainian offensive. Recent photos of Russian defenses have brought their effectiveness into question. For example, some of Russia's Dragon's Teeth seem to have been improperly set up, likely due to a lack of training or military knowledge of the contractors who were installing them. Dragon's Teeth should be connected to one another underground and partially buried. Instead, some Dragon's Teeth are just sitting on the surface, rendering them ineffective. Also, these defenses are supposed to be made entirely of concrete in order to damage or entangle any tank or vehicle trying to go through them. However, images have appeared in the media of crumbling Dragon's Teeth that were poorly made of inadequate materials and are already deteriorating due to environmental factors. It may only be a matter of time before the Ukrainian forces find a faulty barricade or a shoddily built defense structure that allows them to pass through enemy lines easily.
Wouldn't surprise me if they could actually pass through these defensive positions now. The fact that some of these have deteriorated so quickly, just from environmental factors, tells me that if you're going to cut corners for one area, you're probably going to cut corners in all areas. And we've seen this throughout the entire war. Russia cutting corners, be it militarily, be it professionally, be it with leadership, be it with the training within their soldiers, ranks, be it within tactics and stuff like that. When even we've seen soldiers getting out of a vehicle, no helmet or body armor on, in an active battle, in an active war zone, asking to be shot in the head. It blows my brains, guys. It blows theirs as well, quite literally.
And it's almost a guarantee that the training Ukrainian forces have received from NATO, including ways to exploit Russian weaknesses, will play a major role in the operations to come. Number 3. The extensive expanse of the front line works in Ukraine's favor. Russian soldiers and artillery cannot be everywhere all at once or cover every entry point along the front lines. This is why the massive front line that extends all the way across the country works in Ukraine's favor when launching an offensive. The front line is around 621 miles or 1,000 kilometers long, which is more than double the length of the Maginot Line that Nazi Germany smashed through at the start of World War II. It should come as no surprise that defending a long front line is much more difficult than defending a narrow front with choke points. With all of Russia's failures and lack of adequately trained soldiers, there is no way that the entirety of the front line can be monitored or protected at all times. Once the Ukrainian offensive pierces through initial Russian defenses, even just at a single point, it'll allow them to get behind the enemy and encircle them. The Russians will then be trapped while they struggle to fight off Ukrainians in modern tanks closing in on all sides. Once past the front line of defenses, there's a massive amount of unguarded territory that Ukraine can utilize to deploy its forces across the landscape. The Russians have put all of their eggs in one basket. They heavily fortified a single stretch of land, hoping Ukrainian troops won't get behind them. But when they do, because they will find a way, Russian forces will be in big trouble. It's thanks to this vast amount of territory that Russia is trying to defend that the Ukrainian offensive will be successful in the coming months. However, once Russian forces fall back to the land bridge connecting the Crimean Peninsula to the rest of Ukraine, things will become a little more difficult. This is a true choke point, and a location that Russian forces will defend to the last man. New tactics will need to be implemented when Ukraine gets to this stage of the offensive, as any full-on assault into the Crimean Peninsula will result in a massive amount of casualties on both sides.
Massive amount. And this is the point at which I think, although we've liked to, keep away from the word nuke, and yes, that's the way I pronounce it, guys. For anyone watching that says it's pronounced this way, that's how I pronounce it. I don't know if you can tell, I've got a different accent to you. But yeah, nukes, if they're ever going to be used, I think nuclear warheads have more of a potential to be used in this situation in all of the other situations combined, okay? Or rather than all of the situations, because it's been thrown around quite a lot recently, that you might use it then, might use it here. I've been, I've remained quite firm with my opinion that they won't be used at all, but if there ever was a chance that the opportunity that they might actually get used, I think it would be this situation, because it's almost like, it's the final fling, so to speak. You're on the final furlong on the race, nothing else you can do. Boom. That's what I think. But guys, it's your channel. What do you think? Drop a link.
In terms of the current front lines, Ukraine
Not drop a link, drop a comment.
also has an advantage due to the fact that at least some of the soldiers will be familiar with the region, since it was either once their home or they've spent time in the area. This familiarity with the terrain, roads, and strategic natural features will only increase the chances of a successful offensive.
Nah, because you've got to understand, it's also Russia's home as well. Nah, it's not Russia's home. You get what I'm saying, all right? Both are familiar with the area, and the Russians who are living there are more familiar than the Ukrainians. I know some people might used to live there, whatever, but nah, that familiarity isn't going to be as much as it's being mentioned in this. No way.
Number 4, Ukrainian morale is much, much higher than Russian morale.
Yeah.
For starters, Ukrainians are fighting to take back their country from an invader. Russians are fighting to hold on to the territory that Vladimir Putin refuses to give up because it'll make him look weak. These are two very different reasons for fighting. And it's no surprise that Ukrainian soldiers have much higher morals than conscripts and mercenaries fighting for Moscow. There's a sense of nationalism amongst Ukrainians, as everyone, no matter their views, have been unified by a common enemy. This has led to Ukrainian soldiers fighting harder, longer, and without complaint for Ukraine free of Russian oppression. But this feeling extends beyond just the soldiers. Ukrainian civilians have been incredibly resilient and helped with the war effort any way they can. Food and shelter are offered to soldiers. First aid and medical professionals treat wounded civilians and fighters alike. When Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine, it was under the pretense that Ukraine belonged to Russia and that the Ukrainian people wanted to be under the leadership of Moscow. Over a year later, it's clear that Ukrainians want to remain independent and will fight to the bitter end to achieve the goal. When this determination is combined with training, weapons, and tanks that Ukraine is using to launch its offensive, it's going to be very difficult for Russian forces to stop them. Also, it should come as no surprise that the opposite is happening on the Russian ranks. There is no clear unifying mentality other than being forced to fight a war that has no purpose. This has led to Russian soldiers having extremely low morale, which has led to more and more men abandoning the war and seeking asylum in other countries.
Can't blame them. I think they've been, disinterested in this war since the bloody start. Even, can you remember that massive roadblock that was stretching like 7 miles long or something because they ran out of fuel? They must have been thinking then, like, what the hell are we doing here? What are we doing here? No one wants to be here. We haven't even got any food. We got no food or fuel or support, care. It's crazy, man. They don't want this.
Russian court records indicate that the number of absences without leave or AWOL cases has increased. In fact, the number of AWOL cases in the first 4 months of 2023 already exceeded the total number of cases in 2022. Wow. This isn't entirely surprising, as the brutal Ukrainian winter, constant long-range attacks, and inadequate training likely led conscripts who were deployed to the front lines to jump ship before the coming offensive could begin. This begs the question,
don't blame them.
Do the Russian soldiers on the front lines know how poorly their defenses will hold up against the coming offensive?
Of course
the number
they do.
of AWOL cases may be due to a mix of low morale in the Russian ranks and the fear of being crushed under Ukrainian tanks and troops when the offensive fully commences. Number 5. Ukraine has shown resourcefulness and flexibility throughout the war and will continue to do so in the coming offensive. By nature, an offensive must have well-trained commanders leading the effort who can also be flexible and adjust to rapidly changing conditions. Ukrainian leadership and soldiers have shown they have the ability to do this from day one. Whether it's defending their capital from a Russian onslaught or stealing and repurposing Russian tanks, the Ukrainian military has dealt with anything the enemy can throw at them. In the coming weeks and months, Ukrainian forces will need to continue to be adaptable as they probe Russian defenses and find the perfect location and moment to strike. Throughout the conflict, Ukrainian decisions at the platoon, company, and battalion levels have been far superior to their Russian counterparts. This is because of their willingness to improvise and switch tactics while maintaining discipline and falling back on their training. It's almost inevitable that the resourcefulness of the Ukrainian military will end up providing an opportunity to break through the Russian line and decimate their defenses. It wasn't too long ago that Russia held a significant amount of territory in Ukraine. However, as winter approached, Ukrainian forces took back town after town, kicked Russian troops out of entire territories, and pushed them all the way back to the southernmost regions of the country. All of this was done using limited supplies, limited weapons, and limited help from the West. What this means is that the Ukrainian offensive will likely be reminiscent of the battles that pushed Russian forces so far south. Ukrainian leaders and soldiers will use their resourcefulness to exploit weaknesses in the Russian defenses, which will inevitably lead to a successful Ukrainian offensive in the coming months. But the offensive is not without its own challenges. Other than the Russians digging in, Ukraine has been struggling to procure some key assets from the West that would aid in their push south. The whole mission would be much easier if Ukraine had access to more powerful aircraft, such as the F-16. Kyiv has continuously asked Western nations to supply them with aircraft to protect their skies and aid in the push forward. But the United States and its allies have dragged their feet thus far. Supposedly F-16s will be sent at some point, but the Ukrainian offensive cannot wait until they arrive, which will put troops and armor in more danger than they would be if Ukraine had more aircraft. So, what happens next? The success of the Ukrainian offensive hinges on their ability to maintain flexibility while utilizing their training and making informed decisions about when to attack. These things will be possible thanks to key Western weapons and equipment such as modern tanks, UAVs, and hopefully M1 Abrams and F-16s that have been promised to the Ukrainian military. Even without these promises being fulfilled, the Ukrainian offensive will likely succeed due to the high morale of their troops and the resourcefulness of the Ukrainian people. However, when the offensive breaks the Russian defensive line, it's likely that Russian forces will pull back further and further south toward the Crimean Peninsula. Even if the first stages of the offensive are successful, there is still a long road to victory. Vladimir Putin will order his men to defend the crossing into Crimea at all costs. It's not out of the realm of possibility that when Ukrainian troops break the Russian line, Putin will start spewing his previous threats of deploying tactical nukes to Ukraine.
Boom. What did I say? Honestly, guys, and you know I don't pre-watch these stuff. That's exactly what's going to happen if they get pushed that far. And that's when it's going to be like, well, what do we do now? How do we support how do we support Ukraine in a situation like that? Because that kind of affects everyone. I've told you guys this. I hope it doesn't happen that way, but you never know, man.
As a way to deter Ukrainian forces. Can the Ukrainian offensive succeed? Absolutely. Will it? Most likely. But war is far from over. And if Ukraine has any hope of taking back all of its territory, including Crimea, the rest of the world needs to continue to support them and punish Vladimir Putin's Russia for invading their neighbor.
Fantastic video. Can Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia succeed? Yes, but there's provisions with that. There's caveats to that. We've just spoke about it about 10 minutes ago. This video reiterated the fact that, you know, once they probably get pushed south towards Crimea, that's probably when the nuclear rhetoric starts again. Troops, great video. Original link in the description, as well as the link to my online coaching platform where I will be your online coach if you so want me to be. Troops, if you send me a message via Instagram, train, direct message, then you'll get half off that. I'm just doing that today. I didn't even think about it. That's how spontaneous I am. I haven't like planned this and stuff like, oh, we'll just give half off. But I thought, you know what? I'm going to do this video. Yeah, I'll give you 50% off that. If you want to be trained by me. So a little bit more about it because we're at the end of the video now. The beauty of online training is I can support you no matter where you are in the world, and you can have live interactive information and motivation via me on that platform. So I will be designing you a specific training program for your individual needs and goals. It's important this. Don't just watch stuff on YouTube and try and replicate it. It won't work for you because you need something that's tailored towards you. Just like when I went into the Royal Marines, I was training with a an individual who was tailoring my training program fit for my individual ability as well as my weaknesses. And it was also catered towards my goal, okay? So in order to make that realistic, at the time, I needed to improve my strength. So I did a strict strength training program with this individual who's helping me train, and it increased my strength and therefore allowing me a much higher chance of passing and reaching my goals. A lot of people who speak to me online, especially via YouTube, a lot of the guys out there, okay, believe it or not, a lot of the guys have the same thing. They just want to look and feel good within their body. And normally that looks, you know, want to put a bit of muscle mass on, lose a bit of belly fat, want to feel motivated day to day, you know, want to feel energized and worthwhile in life. Believe it or not, a lot of guys don't feel that way. It's the way we live, it's the way we eat, it's the environment in which we live in 2023. It's very different to what it was 20, 30 years ago, guys. So there's multifactorial things that make you feel shit, pretty much. So I'm there to help you guys if you want to do that. It's what I do anywhere with myself. It's what I do, you know, within other realms of my life, online coaching. I've reached a very, very high level of physical fitness in my life, being a Royal Marine, being an athlete in terms of a boxer. I was a national standard boxer. You know, I'm a weightlifter and I like to lift weights now, so I know a lot about nutrition and diet and how to build muscle. And most importantly, the motivational side of things, okay? I used to put people into the military for a living outside of the Marines when I was in charge of effectively a military preparation college. So I know how to get people fit. I know how to get mindset right. And troops, if you're suffering, especially males, most people who watch my channel are male, okay? Within that age group where you should be feeling good, you should be looking good in your own body. It doesn't take that long to change habits. And I can help you change, okay? It's not just a sales pitch. This is the truth. And you'll see that. Join today, link in the description. Let's get moving.